Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure there will be a couple other folks trickling in just with transition between the last session and this session. So hopefully everybody's in the right spot. We're going to talk about growth today. And I just have a really funny story before we get started. Had no idea that this was Tina Turner. So Tanya Moret totally schooled me on this a couple of weeks ago when I was joking with her that I was going to call this session what it is called. And I said, isn't that Donna Summer? And she goes, no. So those of you that are on the call that can appreciate that it is Tina Turner, I hope it's Tina Turner now that I'm thinking about it. It was just kind of a funny ha-ha that was going on our team because I had no idea. So there you go. You learn something new every day, but I knew the song from growing up. So I'm really excited to be here and present during this session with everybody on the call today. For those of you that are just joining us, I will drop the link to the presentation in the chat if you're not already on it, just for reference. But the title for our presentation today is What's Growth Got to Do with It? So we're going to talk about using PVAAS for focused planning, looking ahead into the 2021 school year. So of course I have to start with, since it is summer, oh my goodness, why are we talking about PVAAS? Because it's summer. So hopefully after today, you don't feel like any one of these pictures, maybe this picture right here, you know, I love it when you call me big data. So hopefully if people thinking about you in that light during the school year, because you're going to be so much better equipped going into the school year, knowing some of these pieces. So hopefully folks kind of lean on you in terms of some data support once you leave this session today. But this is a really interesting scenario / situation / world we live in, especially since we're not going to have current growth data on our students moving into this upcoming school year with the cancellation of state testing. So how do we make use of PVAAS and make use of growth data and historical data to help kind of drive some of our data conversations and planning for this upcoming school year? So just a little bit of background on me. My name's Charlie Travato. I'm a professional development specialist here at IU12 in our Ed Services division. My contact information is below my picture. So just a little bit of a historical piece on me. I actually started my educational career in Berks County. So I worked in a high school up in Berks County, teaching secondary math in an integrated STEM program. And then from there started my administrative journey at the IU up in Reading. And I kind of oversaw all of the STEM programming and initiatives for the 18 public school districts that were up there, and also worked very, very closely with our PDE statewide team for PVAAS, did a lot of district consultation with PVAAS and data, and then of course with school improvement as well, and then migrated down here and found my way to IU12 on this awesome team. So I'm super excited to be part of this team and work with our districts and support them as well. But doing pretty much the same thing, working a lot consulting wise with data and school improvement. And then still continuing my work and strengthening my work in curriculum and instruction as well. So I did want to just pause and mention that we have a very, very strong leadership team here in our division. There's 4 of us. We're small but mighty. And we also have a very, very strong and supportive staff development team that are listed on the right-hand side of the screen. And they are absolutely phenomenal. And I'm sure you've been in many sessions over the last 3 days with them and have seen just the absolute wealth of knowledge that they have related to all of the pieces that we're hearing about over these 3 days. So at any point in time, if you need to tap into any of us, any one of us on our leadership team or any of our staff developers on our Ed Services team, please feel free to reach out. Don't ever hesitate. Our emails are on sometimes 24/7. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. I'm sure you've seen this in many of your other sessions, but of course, we're all zoomed out at this point since mid-March, but just wanted to recalibrate everybody around our webinar meeting norms. So of course, engagement's our priority and it's gonna look different for everybody. So I saw Dave was throwing a couple things in the chat that might work for him versus unmuting himself. So if you feel like you need to unmute yourself to ask a question, or you need to throw something in the chat to ask a question, please, please, please feel free to do so. I'd be more than happy to kind of pause and answer those questions. Pretty flexible during this session as well. Of course, if we are asking questions and going into a breakout room to discuss a couple of pieces, you know, we certainly want to honor everybody's perspectives and of course assume good intentions from everybody as well. Act 48, you're going to be awarded Act 48 at the completion of this course, and then this webinar / session, and those evaluations, in order for you to receive Act 48, are going to be due by the close of business on July 31st. So whenever I talk about data, or I start talking about data, my big thing with data is there are kids behind the numbers. And I think all of us can appreciate that on the call. We appreciate looking at data and analyzing data. If you haven't come to appreciate it yet, you're absolutely going to after this session. But when I think about data, I always want you to go back to, what is your story? What's the story of you being in education? What gives you the passion and the breath to keep going? And when we think about that, you know, you can think about multiple things. You can think about the kids you service. You can think about your own kids. You can think about the experiences that you have. But whenever you're thinking about data, I want you to go back to this place, because sometimes we can get so lost in the numbers, and we get lost in sometimes our interpretation of the numbers, and we need to be kind of recentered around what is our purpose here in education and what gives us this driving force behind what we do. And I can tell you right now, these two kiddos give me complete and utter driving force behind what I do in education. The two pictures on the top are my little guy, Ben. He's 3.5 now, which I can't even believe. These were pictures before and after of him getting his first haircut when he was about a year and a half old. Not pictured is my wife, that needed to be absolutely consoled during the process, both before and after getting his haircut. But it was an adventure. It was, you know, like pulling teeth, getting her to the salon or the hair cutting place to get him his haircut for the first time. But he completely changed my outlook on education. And of course, my daughter down there, Ava, who's turning 7 months tomorrow, which is hard to believe. These two have completely shifted how I think about education. And of course, if you are a parent, I'm sure you can appreciate that. If you're not a parent, I'm sure there are pieces that are in your life that give you the drive and the passion to do what you're doing in education. So this is just kind of my story. And whenever I think about working with data, I always try to think about my own kids. And I always tried to think about my own kids in my personal life. And of course, all of my kids that I served in the time I was in the classroom. And now I think about them from more of a county perspective as well. So keep those pieces in mind as you move forward, because I think it's definitely going to help recenter you around something that is so quantitative sometimes. And we need to really think about who is behind those numbers and how are we going to best use the skills that we've attained, whether it's through professional learning or through just experiences, to help support those students. So just a quick overview of our agenda. We're going to talk very briefly at a very high level around achievement and growth. And then I want to spend the bulk of our time this afternoon talking about focusing forward. PDE PVAAS team a few weeks ago actually did a focused forward session. It was phenomenal. And I did pull some pieces from there for those of you that weren't able to attend, to kind of bring them to the center of our conversation today. So again, this is a pretty high level overview. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly around PVAAS in general, and then of course achievement and growth, because it's going to kind of set the stage for the work that we're going to be looking at and going to be doing in terms of planning and being successful in our planning moving forward with regards to data. So what is PVAAS? For those of you that are new to this, PVAAS is our value-added assessment system in Pennsylvania. So it really takes, of course, into consideration two big pieces: our achievement and our growth. And when we look at a value-added assessment system, we're looking at that growth piece. So when we're thinking about PVAAS, we're looking at all of these pieces on the left-hand side of the circle. So anything from our state testing data from PSSA, and of course from Keystones, putting it into this big pot. And then of course, we're looking at it from that individual student lens, and then of course that cohort of student lens, to really bump out two pieces or two different perspectives for us. And one of them is looking back. So we're looking at evaluating school effectiveness, and we're doing this through our value added and our diagnostic reports. And then we're also looking ahead into planning. So looking at planning for student needs, and that's going to be whole student needs. So all of the students that we serve. And then we're also going to look at it from an individual perspective as well. So this could be anything from student projections, individual student projections, and then also whole group student projections for how we're going to do, or looking ahead into how that cohort of students is going to do on upcoming assessments. So when we talk about growth, we also have to talk about achievement and vice versa, because these two pieces are complementary. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that when we think about some of the implications to achievement, we can't control the students that come to us at the end of August, early September. What we can control is the growth. So where we take those students from the second they walk into our classroom or step foot into our virtual environment to the second they leave our classroom or leave our virtual environment. So when we think about achievement, a lot of these components that we're looking at in terms of achievement, we as educators can't control. We can't control our students' socioeconomic status. We can't control our students entering achievement from the previous school year. What we can control, though, is what we're going to do with these students and with their achievement results, which I think is what makes PVAAS and makes value-added assessments so incredibly beneficial to the work that we do as educators. So when we think about reporting types on PVAAS, there are two different reporting types that I mentioned in that looking back piece. So looking at it from more of a historical perspective. The first one is our value added reports, which really helps us answer the question, how is programming working in general for kids? So if we need to take a quick temperature check, we're looking at how did we do in meeting the needs of all of our students? And we can do this from the previous year, or we can do this from a 3-year rolling average. So looking at our current data and then 2 years prior. The diagnostic reports really hone in on the question and help us answer the question, how is our programming working for different types of students? So our students that fall in the lowest quintile of students in the state that are attributed to our school, all the way up to the students that are in that highest quintile, or the students that are in the 80th and above quintile or percentile compared to students in the state that fall within our school. When you log into PVAAS, you're going to see a similar picture to what you're seeing on the screen here, which is our school Launchpad. And of course, I mentioned before, this includes our value-added reports, and then it also includes our diagnostic reports as well. Those value-added reports are the reports that you see in the little cells. They're the 2 cells, the one with the year, the most current set of data, and then that 3-year average. And then your diagnostic report is actually showcased on your Launchpad in a pie graph. So there are your value-added, and there are your diagnostics. Our value-added colors, you're going to see a bunch of different colors that pop up. Green means that we've maintained the achievement of that group of students. Light blue means we've gained some ground, or we have some evidence to say that we've gained ground with our students. Dark blue means that we have some significant evidence that we've grown our students. And then yellow and red mean the complete opposite, that we have some evidence that our students did not maintain or our students fell behind, and red means that we have significant evidence to say that our students did not at least maintain their entering achievement or they fell behind. Understanding the diagnostic colors. So thinking about the different colors that we have for our diagnostic reports, we have some more pastel-y colors here, but they really mean the same thing. Green or light green means that we've maintained that quintile. Light blue means we've had some evidence where we've gained ground, and light red or that pink would mean that we've have some evidence that that group has fallen behind. And then you think about this, when's green okay, right? So let me just get green and I'll be good to go. That is not what we want to think about, because if we put it into two different contexts and we put it into our higher achieving kids, so our kids that are in that third, fourth, and fifth quintile, green shouldn't be a surprise, right? We would want our students to at least maintain their average achievement or maintain their higher achievement. And we're okay with maintaining higher achievement. However, if we put that green into the lowest achieving context, we're looking at our kids in the first and second quintile. So our kids that fall in the 40th percentile or below. And when we put that green color to them and the label of what green means, which means we're maintaining achievement, are we okay with maintaining low achievement? Because that's really what we have with that group of students. So when we look at that color green, of course, we don't want to see all red because that means we're falling behind. We would love to see all blue because that means we're gaining ground. But when we look at green, green can really go either way for us. So green isn't an invitation to kind of pack up our bags and head out. Green's really an invitation for us to look at it through the lens of the quintiles. Are we okay with maintaining low achievement? Are we okay with maintaining high achievement? So thinking about those pieces moving forward, this definitely has some significant implications to the conversations we would have typically with regards to our data. So that's one way that we can analyze this data. So I mentioned that the PDE PVAAS team put on this focused forward webinar or PD series a few weeks ago, and I pulled two resources from the PDE site that are public, and you can certainly use them and manipulate them as you need. The first one is really thinking about the reflection on the 2019 school year, and then two subsequent steps after that to start thinking about planning for the 2021 school year. So if you click on this focus forward picture, that will actually bring you to that particular document. The other piece that I have here is a template spreadsheet that can help you as an educator, as a counselor, as a support staff member, or as an administrator to really start to look holistically across your class or across a grade level or across a school, and look specifically at, okay, well, where were we in terms of our 2019-20 data? Where were we in terms of our historical testing data and growth data? And where do we want to get to based on our diagnostic testing data or our benchmark data that we have available to us? So if you clicked on this picture here where the spreadsheet is, it will actually prompt a download for you, and you can certainly manipulate that as well. But these are two awesome resources that I would suggest everybody taking a look at moving forward after this particular workshop today. So that's kind of the quick and dirty of the value added assessment system that we have. Of course, if there are any questions, you can certainly feel free to throw them into the chat, and I can certainly answer them when we pause to take some questions. The action steps here though. So when we think about what does growth have to do with everything that we're going to be kind of thinking about at this point, there are really three action steps that we want to consider here. The first one is to really know and analyze the data that we have from last school year. So it might seem like because we didn't test our students at the end of the school year with our state assessments, PSSAs or Keystone assessments, that all of a sudden we don't have any of this data that's already available to us. What we do have though is data from the first 3 quarters of our school year. So the beginning of the school year, and of course the majority of the middle of the school year as well. And we also have our growth data from our value-added assessment system that can provide us more of a historical perspective as well. And we have our historical testing data from prior years available to us through multiple different means in our learning management system, or I'm sorry, our student management systems, and through eMetric as well, that can help us really identify and pinpoint trends through a whole group view and then also through a disaggregated view as well. The second step here is to know the data and plan for our 2021 instruction. And then the third piece is to start to think about setting our growth goals and achievement goals simultaneously to help us identify what our priority areas are going to be moving into the 2021 school year. So I'm going to kind of take everybody through that deep dive of each one of those steps here. So the first piece was to start to think about what data do we have, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit already, but we have historical data, we have our data from the beginning of the year to the middle of the year, and then we also have our PVAAS projections. So even though we have currently enrolled students in our school right now coming into the next school year and they don't have testing data from spring 2020, we still have available to us, depending on the year that they're in, enrolled data based on their growth data, which will actually help give us some projections that we can use. So historical data wise, we have achievement results from PSSAs and Keystones, and of course PVAAS growth from prior years. We also have benchmark and diagnostic assessments as well. For our beginning of the year and middle of the year assessments, we have these pieces of data at our disposal, depending on what you've administered or what the school's administered in terms of benchmark and diagnostic assessments. And then in terms of projections, we can look at our projection summary report on PVAAS. We can also look at our custom student reports. We could look at our child success summaries, which will kind of lump all of that data into one nice report for each individual student. And then for our high school folks, we also can look at some projections to Keystones, SATs, ACTs, and APs. And for our elementary and middle school folks, we can look at our PSSAs and our Keystone projections as well. So when we think about with what data do we have, absolutely we can dig into a plethora of data that's showcased on the screen here. So some resources to consider as you're thinking about pulling some of those pieces, and you're probably going, well, where do I get some of those pieces? One of the places we can go to is our e-metric system, or our data interaction for our Pennsylvania student assessments. If you're not an administrator on the call and do not have access to your e-metric account, definitely contact your building administrator or somebody in your central office, because they definitely have a login. Most of the time it's the superintendent, and for the most part it's the building principals. But definitely ask them for that information, because they can pull those reports pretty easily for you and look at, to a very granular level, some disaggregation that you can do in terms of student demographics, and also disaggregation by reporting categories and assessment anchors that on a more historical level. So looking for those trends. The DRC Insight, that's where you would go for your diagnostic assessments regarding CDTs, so your classroom diagnostic assessments. NWEA, I know we have quite a number of folks across our region that are engaging in the MAP assessments, so definitely take a look at digging into your MAP assessment data. And that MAP assessment data is really going to be very similar to our CDT data in that it gives you areas to focus on in terms of student strengths and student areas of growth. For our teachers and administrators on the call that are in the elementary grades, if you're engaging with Acadience, you can certainly pull some reports for your students in Acadience, or even if you're working with Dibbles on that benchmarking, you can certainly pull some data from Dibbles as well. Anybody on the call can engage in our instructional level resources that have been compiled actually by one of our leadership team members, Tanya Moret, when she was in her role as the gifted liaison or the gifted state liaison across the state prior to coming to IU12. So this is a really awesome resource if you're trying to think about, well, what standards do I want to look at by grade level and subject area? What tests do I have access to, or should I have access to, based on their specific classification? And what are some other things that I can pull from by grade level and by subject area that I can start to dig into some of that data and analyze it at a student level? So this is available to everybody in terms of ELA, broken down by grade level: elementary, middle, high. Math, same thing, elementary, middle, high. And then for science, at the upper elementary for 4th, the middle school level, 8th grade, and then of course 9 to 12 with general science, biology, and then chemistry as well. So definitely an awesome resource for folks that are looking to really kind of data geek out a little bit, and start to dig into some of those different resources in terms of assessments, um, summative, formative, benchmark, diagnostic, and other, moving into your data analysis. So just some resources to consider as you start to think about that historical testing data. And then, of course, once we get back to school and back into the swing of things and we start to assess our students to figure out where their gaps are, we can certainly use things like CDTs, MAP assessments, and Acadians as well. So when we think about the work that we're doing in step one of our action plan, we're really looking at setting our direction. And typically what we would do is think about our mission statement, we would think about our current status on Future Ready, and we would think about our goals of performance measures as well. So what I would always encourage folks to do is if you haven't been to your Future Ready platform for your building, I would absolutely encourage you to do that, because you're going to see all of this kind of compiled into one nice package. Everything from that top level of your achievement data all the way down to that bottom level of your growth expectations and meeting those annual growth expectations through PVAAS. So all of these pieces, now while it doesn't break it out into individual grade levels, what it does is give you a global perspective around how the school has been doing in terms of these three areas around ELA, math, and science. So what you would typically do is look at your mission statement, pick your focus area, and start to think about your goal or performance. So your achievement and then your growth goals. So where we're at right now, looking at the pandemic and looking ahead into 2021, this really doesn't fit this mold at this point. But what we want to do is really keep this in the back of our mind, because we do have a mission statement for our district, and we might have a mission statement for our school to keep in mind. You might also have a focus area that you've been working on, or your principals or your departments or your grade team has been working on as well. So you want to keep that in mind. And then of course, we might tweak what our goal performance is going to be. So when we set our achievement goals and our growth goals, we might change those slightly depending on the data that we're going to be digging into. So this is kind of the process that you're going to be going through. You're going to review that benchmark or diagnostic data. So thinking about what learning data do you have from your students, comparing your PVAAS projections, so where are students making progress, and then evaluating that progress. What evidence do you have of the progress that you're making at this point? So when you're looking at your PVAAS projections, I pulled just a really quick snapshot from the projection summary. I looked at currently enrolled eighth graders projected to the 8th grade PSSA math. And this is at the proficient level. So when I think about this, I want you to think, who are the students that were slated to take this assessment in the spring of 2020? Were they making continued progress? What does their middle of the year data for these students suggest? Because we have access to all of these pieces here. We have access to who the students were that were slated to take the assessment, how they were doing in terms of making continuous progress, and we also have, based on the tests that we've administered or the assessments that we've administered, whether they were summative assessments, formative assessments, diagnostic assessments, or benchmark assessments, what did their beginning of the year to the middle of the year data suggest for that student where we left them off? So I also want you to think about this, what progress data do you have for the students that you serve? So this is a really great example, this growth and focus report that we would typically get from our CDT or our classroom diagnostic tools on that DRC website, looking at middle of the year data for how students were doing in terms of their growth and what focus areas we could look at as well. So thinking about what progress data do you have for these kids that you're servicing and have serviced during the 1920 school year. So I'm going to pause there to see if there are any questions, and I'll take a look at the chat. So feel free to throw something in the chat, or unmute yourself and we can just have a conversation. And if not, we can certainly move on to step 2. But any questions regarding that first step to our action planning, which is really knowing and analyzing your 1920 data and any of that historical data that you've come to pull together.
I just have a question about the growth scores. Like if you go back to, I guess you pulled it off of the Future Ready Index site. So like if it says a growth score of 50.0, is that a percentage?
Okay, that's a really great question. So they're actually not percentages. So they are scores that come from the average growth index. So it's basically, it's taking what your AGI would be on PVAAS in terms of your particular growth score on PVAAS. And there's this really interesting calculation that takes that growth score and transfers it into this scaled score from 50 to 100. So there's a point where if you're under a certain if you're under a certain score, that's where you're seeing the red color populate, that in general that all student group didn't meet the standard for growth. If you're between a certain 2 scores, you fall in that green category. So it says, okay, academic growth score wise, we met the statewide growth standard. And then above a certain score is where we're seeing that our all student group on average was exceeding. So you can't dip below a 50 and you can't go above 100, but that sweet spot in the middle, based on what your AGI is on PVAAS, will actually give you, once it's converted to this academic growth score on Future Ready, will give you what your color indicator is and what your effectiveness was in terms of your academic growth. But if you're interested in seeing what that what the calculation is between what you would typically see AGI wise on PVAAS and what you're seeing on Future Ready, I can certainly share that with you once the in the resources section once we're done today.
Okay, so you said an academic growth score can't be lower than 50.
It won't go lower than 50.
So in this case here, so for English language arts, literature, 50, like, so that would say there was 0 growth made with that population of students. Am I reading that correctly?
So that would typically mean that your AGI on PVAAS is lower than a negative 3.0. So without getting into the weeds of what the numbers, I want you to focus more on the colors, but basically that would mean that the all student group for our growth either had some evidence that they weren't meeting the achievement of that group of students, or there was significant evidence to say that they were falling behind. So if you're seeing that red come up, it's kind of the same color indicator that we would see on PVAAS, that we aren't meeting our students entering achievement. It means that we weren't able to maintain their overall achievement on average. So if we see the green pop up, that means for us, the expectation from the state is that we're at least meeting the statewide growth standard, which would be we're at least maintaining student achievement.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? And feel free to unmute or throw something in the chat. I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm gonna just kind of keep moving, but feel free to, again, unmute or just throw something in the chat if you have a question. The second step here is the planning piece. So what are we gonna do with all of this data that we've analyzed or we're collecting, right? So I kind of just re-put in here what that initial table was that I showed everybody initially under step 1. So we have these 3 bucket areas of historical data, your beginning of the year to middle of the year data from last year, and then your projections to 2021. So I want to just kind of walk you through an example of what this would look like. So here's an example. This is 7th grade math. You can do this for any of your grades. I will say for the purposes of PVAAS, you're going to be doing this for your students growth score wise, 4th on up. So grades 4 on up. You can get the achievement data for 3rd grade if your students were the currently enrolled students in PVAAS under that data collection took the 3rd grade PSSA. So that's kind of why initially I was saying we might want to look at the diagnostic data and of course look at some of that benchmarking data, DIBELS, Acadians, et cetera, for our students that are K1, 2, and 3. So here's an example for 7th grade looking at achievement and growth. So I pulled from my example school, redacted the name, their e-metric information. So I pulled historical data from them. So I'm looking at historically, what were the percentage of students in each 7th grade cohort that scored proficient or advanced in these 3 school years, these 3 prior school years. So I looked at 16-17, 17-18, and 18-19. And what I found was 66%, 64%, and 65% respectively in those years were scoring proficient or advanced. So it was a little bit less than 3/4. So it was about 2/3 of the students were scoring at the proficient or advanced level in 7th grade. And when I went into PVAAS, I looked specifically at, well, what was their color indicator in their value added report? So in 16-17, I noticed on average, they were maintaining their achievement. In 17-18, I noticed that there was some evidence that they were falling behind. And in 18-19, I noticed that there was significant evidence that they were falling behind. So overall, in their 3-year average, when I look at their 3-year average, it's indicating that that student group in 7th grade is on average falling behind. So I want to keep that in mind. I have achievement here that's kind of at that 2/3 mark. So 2/3 of my students are achieving proficient or advanced on their assessments. But on average, looking at that 3-year average, it looks like my students aren't at least growing, right? Or at least maintaining their achievement. They're falling behind in terms of their growth. So I have that picture of the 7th grade math students. When I look at their diagnostic data and dig a little bit down into this, the question I want to ask myself is, what does my middle of the year achievement data look like from my 19-20 school year? So I want to include this. So I went ahead and I pulled their report, their group progression report or their group map from CDT on DRC. And I started to look, if you noticed on here, most of my students are falling in that green. I might have a couple of students here and there that are falling in the top portion of the red level. So really that means that our students are not meeting course level, end of course level expectations. Our students in the green are meeting end of course level expectations, and our students in the blue would be exceeding course level expectations. So thinking about these students that I'm seeing and pulling their score ranges for the 7th grade assessment that they took, most of our students are in this green scale score range. So they are meeting or they're on level at this point. So when I think about that and look at the percentage of students that are falling in that on track percentage, I'm looking at about 85% of my students from last year that were falling based on their middle of the year achievement data. They were falling in that green scale score range, which means that they're in the process of meeting end of course level expectations for 7th grade. So looking ahead now, looking at all that data, the past data that we have, the historical data, the data from last year, looking ahead into their projections, what about these kids that are upcoming into 7th grade? So the kids that are upcoming into 7th grade are in PVAAS currently the 6th grade enrolled students. because that data hasn't rolled over yet. We haven't moved our currently enrolled sixth graders to their currently enrolled seventh grade status yet. So when I pull this data or these reports, I'm looking specifically at my currently enrolled sixth graders from the 1920 school year and how they're projected to perform on their seventh grade PSSA math assessment at a proficient level. And if you haven't seen these reports yet, in the projection summary reports, you're going to see three different probabilities. You're going to see students that have a greater than 70% chance based on their historical testing performance and their growth data in PVAAS of achieving the indicated performance level of proficient. So right now, looking at my currently enrolled sixth graders that are going to be seventh graders in the fall, looking at how they're projected to do based on their historical testing performance, I'm noticing about 40% of them have a greater than 70% chance of reaching a proficient level score on their assessment. I also have students that are more at risk. So my students that have less than a 40% chance, which is about 38% of my students. And then of course you have your students that are kind of like your bubble kids, right? They can kind of go either way. They have a between 40 and 70% chance of, of reaching that performance level. And then, of course, you might get some students, depending on the grade level, where they don't have a projection because they might not have historical testing performance in the system, or they might be coming from out of state, or you might have students that have already taken the assessment. So you might have students, for example, my high school folks that already have students that have tested that are going to be upcoming into their class. So when you're looking at this data, there are a couple of things that I want you to pause and think about. What are our trends? So right now I have roughly 65% of the students, thinking back to my historical data, that were proficient or advanced. But looking at their growth data, they historically fell behind. And then thinking about looking ahead, 85% of those students were on level by the time we got to the middle of the year last year, but only 40% have a greater than 70% chance of reaching some type of proficiency on their assessment, on their end of course assessment when we're thinking about the PSSA. And then again, 54%, looking at the other group of students that are in these two probability areas, have a 54% chance, or 54% of them do not have less than a 70% chance of achieving that performance level. So I want you to think about what this specifically means. And what I'm going to do is put everybody in breakout groups for probably about 2 to 3 minutes. And I just want you to discuss with the folks that are in your breakout groups what the implications of the example data that I gave might have on your instructional planning for next year. So that's the only thing I want you to talk about, is based on those 3 slides on the data that we had from last year, the data of those students, looking at their middle of the year data on CDT, and then their projection data for next year. What implications do you feel like the example data might have on instructional planning for the 2021 school year? So I'm going to put everybody in breakout groups. I'm just going to randomly put you in like 3 breakout rooms to just chat about this really briefly. And then we'll kind of come back together and discuss. So I'm going to open this up for just about 3 minutes to discuss, and then I'll go ahead and close everybody out, and we'll share out after that. So what are the instructional implications based on all of that data that we would have in planning for our 2021 school year? All right, welcome back. I'm sure I cut somebody off in mid-sentence, so I do apologize. It's always what happens with breakout rooms. So this is going to just kind of be a volunteer. We can just kind of round robin as we go. But what was part of your discussion? So based on that data that we showed, what were some of the implications that data might have on instructional planning for next school year?
I kind of I can comment a little bit about that. One thing I was saying a lot is that even though there was continuity of education that occurred last year, instruction looks so much different. And a lot of times it was just folks trying to do the best they could under the circumstances they had. And then even with instruction coming up this year, there's going to be such variety and differences and things like that happening. So in terms of even tailoring instruction, I think it's going to be difficult because it's just going to be different. With that being said, I mean, it can give you an idea as to if things were quote unquote normal. It can give you a sense as to which areas you might need a boost to hit in your core curriculum. But I think you really kind of need to pull in some other information in order to really kind of get a better picture of things. And like an initial benchmark assessment, I think is going to be really critical in a more typical educational format. And we'll just have to see what that format looks like come the fall.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. And I appreciate your perspective on that because you hit on some really great things, right? Like we're in a completely different environment right now. So if we think about quote unquote business as usual or business as normal, we would be thinking about some of these priority areas, right? And thinking about how we're going to attack them in a face-to-face environment, right? But we also have this piece now where it's so uncertain of where we're going to be addressing some of these pieces. And we also need to think about our students' continuity of education from the middle of the year to the end of the year last year as well. So implementing something like an initial benchmark or an initial diagnostic, maybe a few weeks into school, once we kind of get the culture back to where it needs to be, regardless of physicality, I think that's absolutely something that is going to help take this data to the next level. Now, we might not make a decision based on this data. We might need some other pieces of the puzzle to help us make a better informed decision, but it's definitely a start for us. So we can start to think about and morph what is our priority area. And for those of you that weren't with me on Monday when I did the session around addressing the essentials, Lisa's saying it too. Hey, Lisa.
And that's what I was going to bring up. That was extremely valuable. And that's what we touched upon because my other colleague was in the session as well. And that was extremely valuable and love the different charts and things and going down through like, this is absolutely essential to teach. This isn't, I mean, all important. It's not the essential basis, like what do the kids really need to learn and really need to touch on. So that's exactly what I was going to say. That session itself was really important.
Awesome. Yeah, I would definitely say, and it was great to have Lisa and her colleague on because we kind of stayed on and chatted a little bit after and touched on a lot of these points. And I think if you weren't part of that, I would definitely recommend, not just because it was me doing it, but of course, because of the content in it, I think dovetailing this presentation around growth and this conversation around growth and data with addressing the essentials from Monday's session absolutely will help you pinpoint based on your historical data and the data that was presented. It's going to give you a more well-rounded picture of what areas you really need to pinpoint in your instruction for next year. And I think to Dave's point, that's exactly what is kind of like the next step here. So that's awesome. Anything else? Any other pieces of the discussions that you've had around implications for this particular data on instruction for next year?
So Charlie, whose role would this be? Like, again, I'm thinking Lisa's a classroom teacher, right, Lisa? So who, I mean, again, would this be if schools have MTSS teams or who's doing what?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So depending on your role, it's of course going to be dependent on what's going to be dependent on your I shouldn't say engagement level, but your digging into this data at a specific level is going to be dependent on what your role is and what the oversight is going to be. Obviously, a classroom teacher digging into this is going to look just at the students that they're serving. If you're looking at it as a grade level team or as an MTSS team, you might look at it from a grade level perspective and start to identify some of those areas or gaps or even strengths from our students at a grade level or through a specific content. So we can look historically, we can horizontally, or we can look vertically. And then of course your, guidance counselors, your principals, any of your support teachers in terms of your gifted support teachers, like you might be looking at this from a building perspective and start thinking about, what does this mean? What are the implications for our school as a whole with regards to what this data is actually presenting itself? So that's a great question. Definitely looking at it through multiple lenses. And I think too, when we think about data, we don't want to just think about the quantitative data that we're getting here too. I did mention, potentially looking at assessing your students, a few weeks into school, not doing it right when you get back to school, because that social emotional piece is going to be critical for our kids this year. And, you might be doing something related to PVAAS or related to school culture, and you're going to have that qualitative data or that perspective data to help drive some of the work that you're going to do with this particular data as well. So it's not just about the numbers. We also want to look at it through that perceptual data as well. Great. So the last piece that I wanted to show here, and then we'll wrap up, is kind of our third step, which is all around achievement and growth goals. So of course, achievement is not alone going to provide our educators with this full picture. And we have to really think about combining achievement with what we're seeing in terms of our growth goals as well. So I love this statement on the bottom that no achievement goal stands alone, just like none of us as educators stand alone. It takes a village, right? So when we think about achievement and growth, we want to kind of put them together. They are working in a complementary fashion. So I have some sample if-then statements in terms of goal statements here for you if you're interested in digging into them a little bit more. But your growth data or your growth goal is probably the one that's going to be the easier of the two to write, because we're going to say we want to at least maintain achievement or we want to show growth, depending on where we are and what our data is suggesting. So just have a couple examples here for folks. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. We could have something, for example, like students in ELA are going to gain, they will gain as evidenced by PVAAS, or students in ELA will move from maintaining the green to gaining blue. Or we might have something like students in ELA will gain as evidenced by our average index, right? We were talking about the AGI before. So we can pull that piece in as well. So this is really going to all be dependent on your growth data specifically. Adding the achievement level now, so adding the achievement goal in is going to kind of bring a new life to this. So we have our growth goal. So I have this split up for you just as an example from a school level perspective as a growth goal all the way down to our grade level goals. And we might include something like percentage of students that are going to reach proficiency or above is going to increase by a particular percentage. So we want it to go from this percentage to this percentage, proficient or advanced. So I mentioned growth goals are a little easier to write because the achievement goals, you really have to dig into some of that other quantitative data. And it's going to include quantitative data from our first and second steps to this action plan, looking at the historical data, looking at the current data, and then looking at that projection data. So your achievement goals are a little bit more involved because you're looking more specifically at percentage of students and also quantifying the number of students as well that you're looking to potentially move based on this holistic perspective of data. So again, I have some other examples for you as you are trying to think about what your achievement goals might look like. And of course, whenever we're throwing this in here, I don't want this to just kind of be the end of the road. I want you to think about, and I challenge you to think about, where are you aligning this to your practice? So thinking about what your professional learning is going to look like, thinking about your grade level PLCs. Phyllis brought up your MTSS teams. How do we dovetail these pieces into the work of our MTSS team? Thinking about your student learning objectives, so your SLOs. How do we use some of these pieces to drive the work of our SLOs? Walkthroughs, observations, et cetera, et cetera. If you're working with an instructional coach, if we have any instructional coaches on the call, this is an awesome opportunity for you to dig in and work specifically with teachers that might need intensive support or just might need some surface level support on aligning these goals to their particular practice. So always kind of keeping it in the back of their minds and at the forefront of their practice, just like we would with a school or a district mission statement. And then I just have an example of what this alignment and practice could look like. But I am watching the time and I know we're just about wrapping up. So I'm going to just kind of skip over those. But I hope that after this session, you don't feel like my little guy did when he was learning how to push this owl for the first time. So he was a little backwards. I hope you don't feel like that after going through this session. So just kind of wanted to leave everybody with a little funny ha-ha here. He does not do this now, by the way. He uses it as a weapon at home, so we have to take it away half the time. But I'm hoping that you will use data as your weapon to drive the work and focus your work moving into the 2021 school year. So as you think about your reflection on today's session and thinking about your evaluation, I want you to think about these three things, 3-2-1 protocol. So thinking about 3 new ideas that you're going to take from today, 2 steps you plan to take based on today's session, and it's totally okay to have a question, because if you don't have a question, then you weren't listening. So I think having these 3 things kind of in your back pocket in terms of your reflection, and then thinking about translating those onto the evaluation side, I certainly would appreciate learning a little bit more about your 3-2-1 here. So with that said, there are a bunch of resources here for folks if you're still interested in digging in. I try to not make it a resource dump, but with a lot of this information, sometimes it becomes a little bit of a resource dump. I know there was a question about from Dave that I'm going to throw in here as well right after this regarding the AGI information. But hopefully this session met your expectations, so feel free to fill out that evaluation. I will be most appreciative of your feedback. And then I will stick around if there are specific questions from folks, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions and have a great rest of your afternoon and a great rest of your summer.